Some decisions don't announce themselves with thunder or lightning. They arrive quietly, like two figures collapsing in the snow outside your door. Marcus Thornfield had one wool blanket left in his cabin that night. Just one. And when dawn broke over the Colorado Ridge, 400 warriors would arrive demanding answers he didn't have. The fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting dancing shadows across the rough-hewn walls of the cabin. Marcus sat in his father's oak chair, turning a yellowed letter between calloused fingers. Sarah's handwriting still looked fresh after 3 years, though the paper had grown soft from countless readings. Outside, the November wind howled through the pines, driving snow against the glass windows he'd installed last month. $3 each, shipped all the way from Denver, worth every penny when winter came calling. He glanced at the daguerreotype on the mantel. Sarah in her white wedding dress, himself in his cavalry dress uniform, both young and believing the world held nothing but promise. Beside it sat Thomas's carved wooden horse, missing one ear from when the boy had dropped it racing around the cabin. 8 years old and convinced he could make that horse gallop faster than the wind. Marcus closed his eyes and let the memory wash over him. Sarah's laugh when Thomas pretended to be a cavalry officer, charging imaginary Indians with his wooden sword. The way she'd scold them both for tracking mud across her clean floors, then smile when she thought they weren't looking. How she'd sing while mending clothes by lamplight, her voice soft as summer rain. "Had a quiet day today," he said to the photograph, continuing their nightly conversation. "Thomas would have liked watching that deer family by the creek. Remember how he always wanted to pet the fawn?" The silence answered him, as it always did. Marcus rose and walked to the window, peering through frost-etched glass at the valley below. 640 acres of prime Colorado territory earned fair and square under the Homestead Act. The well he dug ran 40 feet deep, clean water year-round. His cabin stood solid against the elements, built from Douglas fir with his own hands. Come spring, the valley would bloom with wildflowers and sweet grass. Sarah would have loved it here. But tonight something felt wrong. He'd learned to trust that feeling during 8 years on the frontier, first as a cavalry sergeant chasing Comanche raiders across Texas, then as a civilian trying to carve out a life worth living. The animals knew it too. This afternoon the deer had fled the meadow without reason. The birds had gone silent. Even his horse, Buck, stood restless in the stable, ears pricked towards sounds only he could hear. Marcus checked his trusted Winchester rifle that had saved his life more times than he cared to count. 30 rounds in the ammunition box, enough for whatever might come calling. He hoped. The splitting maul leaned against the wall where he'd left it after chopping wood. His shoulders still ached from the work, but winter demanded preparation. The woodpile outside held enough split logs to last until spring, assuming he rationed carefully. 2 bushels of corn, 50 pounds of flour, and various preserved goods filled his larder. Enough for one man to survive the mountain winter. One wool blanket lay folded on his bed, thick and warm, purchased from a traveling merchant for $4 precious. It was the difference between comfort and misery when the temperature dropped below freezing. Marcus had learned the value of such things the hard way. He moved to the kitchen table where Sarah's Bible lay open to Psalm 23, a blue ribbon marking the passage where he'd stopped reading. "I will fear no evil, for thou art with me." The words had brought comfort once. Now they felt like questions without answers. Beside the Bible sat Thomas's sewing basket, the shirt she'd been making for him, still unfinished. One sleeve remained unpinned, waiting for hands that would never complete the work. Marcus had tried once to finish it himself, but his soldier's fingers were too clumsy for such delicate work. The wind gusted, rattling the windows and sending snow spiraling past the glass. Somewhere in that white chaos, Marcus heard something that made his blood run cold. Hoofbeats, not the steady clip-clop of a single horse, but the muffled thunder of many animals moving through deep snow. They stopped just beyond the tree line, close enough to hear but too far to see. Marcus extinguished the lamp and moved to the window, pressing his face to the cold glass. Nothing moved in the pale moonlight. The snow fell thick and straight, muffling sound and blurring shapes into ghostly suggestions. But he knew they were out there watching his cabin, weighing their options. Marcus cursed silently. He'd left his rifle by the door when he went out to split wood, a moment of carelessness that might cost him everything. In this country, such mistakes were often final. Minutes passed. The hoofbeats resumed, circling his property like wolves around a campfire. Then gradually they faded into the distance, leaving only the wind and falling snow. Marcus waited another hour before lighting the lamp again. Whatever had been out there was gone for now, but the feeling of being watched lingered like smoke from a dying fire. He was splitting wood the next afternoon when the silence came. Not the absence of sound, but the wrong kind of silence. The kind that makes every muscle lock up because something isn't right. Marcus lowered the maul, wiped sweat from his forehead despite the bitter cold, and scanned the tree line. Nothing moved, but the feeling didn't leave. The sun was dropping fast behind the western peaks, pulling the temperature down with it. His breath formed small clouds in the freezing air as he gathered the split logs. That's when he saw them. Two dark shapes against the pale snow, barely moving near the fence line 50 yards out. Marcus set down the wood, his hand instinctively reaching for the rifle that wasn't there. Stupid. He'd gotten too comfortable, too careless. He stood perfectly still, watching. They weren't approaching, weren't threatening. One figure knelt beside the other, both dressed in dark clothing unsuited for the brutal cold now settling over the valley. No horses visible, no supplies he could make out. Every instinct screamed at him to go inside, bar the door, and pretend he'd seen nothing. In this territory, that's what kept you breathing. Mind your own business, don't get involved, especially not with strangers who might be bait for something worse waiting in the shadows. But then one of them tried to stand and immediately collapsed again. Marcus exhaled slowly, his breath forming a white cloud in the frigid air. He thought about the warm cabin behind him, the single blanket on his bed, the supplies that would last him through winter if he was careful. If he shared them, there might not be enough. He thought about the night his family died while he was away, leading a wagon train through hostile territory. How no one had been there to help Sarah and Thomas when they needed it most. How the neighbors had heard Sarah's cries for help and done nothing because getting involved meant risk. His jaw tightened. He walked back to the cabin, grabbed the wool blanket from his bed, and picked up his Winchester. Then he started walking toward the two figures near the fence. As he got closer, details emerged from the gloom. Both were women, Apache by their clothing and the way they wore their long black hair. The one on the ground appeared to be around 27, her face drawn with pain and exhaustion. Dark blood stained the doe-skin fabric over her ribs. The other woman, perhaps 30 years old, had positioned herself as a shield between him and her injured companion. This one's eyes tracked his every movement, sharp and defensive despite her obvious exhaustion. When Marcus stopped 10 feet away, she moved her hand to something at her belt. A knife, most likely. He studied them both, noting details that would matter in the next few minutes. The standing woman wore silver armbands and a turquoise hairpiece that caught the dying sunlight. Quality work, expensive. Maybe $200 worth of jewelry, which meant these weren't ordinary Apache women fleeing some minor dispute. The wounded one carried a medicine bag decorated with sacred symbols. A healer, then. Someone important to her tribe. Marcus slowly held up the blanket with one hand, keeping his rifle pointed at the ground with the other. Neither woman moved. The temperature was dropping by the minute. In another hour, they'd be beyond help regardless of his intentions. He took one step forward and laid the blanket on the snow between them. Then he stepped back, waiting. The standing woman stared at him with eyes that could cut through stone. She didn't reach for the blanket, didn't speak. Just watched him like she was calculating exactly how fast she could kill him if he made the wrong move. And somewhere in the distance, so faint he almost missed it, Marcus heard something that made his blood run cold again. The sound of drums, war drums, pounding in rhythm, growing steadily louder. The woman guarding her wounded sister had eyes like winter sky before a storm, pale blue and hard as flint. She still hadn't touched the blanket, hadn't moved except to shift her weight between him and the injured woman. The temperature continued its relentless descent, and still she stood there, refusing his offer. Marcus kept his distance, rifle loose in his grip, pointed down. He knew what she was thinking, because he'd think the same thing. Trust gets you killed out here. Especially trust offered by strangers who appear from nowhere with help that seems too convenient. The sound of distant drums had faded, but that didn't mean safety. Could mean they'd stopped to regroup. Could mean they were spreading out, circling back. Could mean a lot of things, None of them good for a lone rancher caught between two Apache women and whatever was hunting them. He nodded toward his cabin, its windows glowing warm yellow in the gathering dusk. It's warmer inside. The woman didn't respond. Her sister, the one on the ground, was shivering now, despite trying to hide it. The wound on her side had stopped bleeding, but the fabric around it was stiff with dried blood. She needed clean bandages, water, rest. Most importantly, she needed warmth. "I'm not asking you to trust me," Marcus said quietly, his words forming white clouds in the freezing air. "I'm asking you to trust that you won't survive the night out here." Still nothing from the standing woman, but he saw something flicker in her expression. Not softening exactly, but calculation. She was weighing odds, measuring risks, trying to determine which choice would kill them slower. The wounded woman looked up at her sister and said something in Apache, her voice barely above a whisper. The standing woman's jaw tightened, but she nodded once. Marcus slowly crouched down and set his rifle in the snow. Then he stood up, both hands visible and empty. "I'm going back inside," he said. "Door stays open. You decide." He turned and walked away, fighting every instinct that screamed at him to keep watching them, to keep his weapon close. But if he wanted them to believe he wasn't a threat, he had to act like it. The walk back to the cabin felt like it took an hour. He could feel their eyes on him the entire way, could almost hear them weighing their options in rapid Apache conversation. When he reached the porch, he didn't look back. He just went inside, left the door wide open like he'd promised, and busied himself building up the fire. Cold air poured through the open doorway, stealing what little heat the room had managed to gather. Marcus fed more split wood into the iron stove, flames catching and spreading with satisfying crackles. Behind him, he heard nothing but wind and the soft whisper of falling snow. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The fire was roaring now, filling the small cabin with warmth that immediately escaped through the open door like water through a broken dam. Marcus stood at the stove with his back to the entrance, giving them space, giving them time to make their choice. Then he heard it, the soft crunch of boots on frozen ground, slow and hesitant, getting closer. He didn't turn around, just kept his hands where they could see them, and his movements calm and predictable. The footsteps stopped just outside the door, and he could feel them studying him, studying the cabin, looking for traps or tricks or reasons to run back into the night. "If you come in," the woman's voice said, rough with cold and caution, "you stay where I can see you." "Fair enough," Marcus replied without turning. A long pause. Then the footsteps entered, accompanied by the sound of someone being half carried, half dragged across the threshold. He heard them settle near the door, as far from him as the small room allowed. The blanket rustled as it was wrapped around both of them. Only then did Marcus finally turn around. The two women were pressed against the wall near the entrance, the wounded one barely conscious, the other watching him with that same cutting stare. She had positioned them so they were between him and the only exit. Smart thinking for someone who'd probably been hunted across half the territory. Now, in the firelight, he could see them more clearly. The injured woman's face was pale but peaceful, her breathing shallow but steady. The medicine bag at her side was decorated with symbols Marcus didn't recognize, but the quality of the beadwork spoke of someone with status in her tribe. The protective sister was younger than he'd first thought, maybe 29 or 30, with the kind of lean muscle that came from years of hard living. Her silver armbands were etched with intricate patterns, and the turquoise hairpiece was clearly a family heirloom. These weren't refugees fleeing some minor tribal dispute. These were women of importance, which made their presence in his cabin infinitely more dangerous. "There's water warming by the fire," Marcus said, gesturing to a pot he'd set on the stove, clean cloth for bandages on the table. The woman's eyes flicked to the supplies, then back to him. "Why are you doing this?" It was a fair question. Marcus thought about lying, about giving her some noble answer that would make sense and keep him alive. But lies had a smell to them, and this woman would catch it faster than a hawk spots a field mouse. "Because nobody else will," he said simply. She studied him for a long moment, then glanced at her sister. The decision had already been made by coming inside, but he could see her second-guessing it now, wondering if she'd just traded one death for another. Outside, the wind howled louder, driving snow against the windows with increasing force. And somewhere in that wind, distant but distinct, came the sound that changed everything. The rhythmic thunder of Apache war drums, growing steadily closer. The drum beats were intensifying, not close yet, but close enough that Marcus could feel the pounding rhythm in his chest, steady and ominous as a funeral march. The standing woman heard them too. Her entire body tensed, and for the first time since entering his cabin, her attention shifted away from him. "How many?" Marcus asked quietly. She didn't answer right away. Her sister made a small sound, a low groan of pain that broke through the tension in the room. The woman's jaw tightened, and Marcus saw the decision form in her eyes before she spoke. "Enough to turn this cabin into ash," she said, her voice flat as iron, "with us inside it." Marcus moved slowly toward the table and picked up the cloth he'd mentioned earlier. He soaked it in the warm water by the fire, wrung it out, then held it up so she could see it clearly. No hidden weapons, no sudden movements. "Let me help her," he said, "and then you can tell me what's really happening." The woman looked at her sister, then back at him. The drums pounded again, closer this time. Whatever was coming wouldn't wait for them to sort out trust issues. "Touch her wrong," the woman said, her voice flat as winter stone, "and I'll open your throat before you take another breath." "Understood." Marcus approached slowly, every movement visible and deliberate. The wounded woman was conscious but fading fast. Her skin was pale and cold despite the blanket wrapped around both of them. The wound on her side wasn't deep, but infection had set in. Red lines were starting to spread from the edges, and Marcus recognized the signs from his army days. Without treatment, she'd be dead before dawn. He knelt a few feet away and set the cloth down between them. "I need to clean it. It's going to hurt." The standing woman crouched beside her sister, one hand on her shoulder, the other resting near the knife at her belt. "Do it." Marcus worked quickly and carefully, cleaning the wound with warm water and checking for embedded debris. The injured woman bit down hard but didn't cry out. Tough as leather, both of them. Tougher than most men he'd known. When the wound was clean, he tore a strip from his own shirt and bound it tight. It wasn't perfect, but it would keep infection from spreading until proper medicine could be found. "That's all I can do for now," he said, moving back to give them space. The standing woman checked the bandage herself, her fingers quick and practiced. She'd done this before, Marcus realized. Probably too many times. Then she looked up at him, and something in her expression had changed. Not trust exactly, but recognition that he'd had chances to hurt them and hadn't taken any of them. "My name is Ayana," she said. "This is my sister, Sitlali." Marcus nodded. "Marcus Thornfield." "We were traveling north," Ayana continued, her voice careful but no longer hostile. "6 days ago, we stopped near Sacred Spring to gather winter medicines. Men attacked us there, said they could get good money for Apache women." Her hand tightened on the knife handle. "Said we'd bring prime prices in the Mexican markets." Marcus felt ice form in his stomach. He'd heard stories of such men, raiders who specialized in human cargo. "You got away." "We killed 2 of them," Ayana said with grim satisfaction. "But the others followed. We've been running since, trying to reach our father's winter camp." "Then lose them," Marcus said. "You're safe now." Ayana's laugh was bitter and short. "You don't understand. Those drums aren't from the slavers." Marcus felt the blood drain from his face. "Then who?" Ayana looked toward the door, toward the sound of drums that kept getting louder, kept getting closer. "Our people. They're looking for us." "That's good then," Marcus said, relief flooding through him. "They'll help you." "No." Ayana met his eyes, and in that moment Marcus saw real fear for the first time. Not fear of him, not fear of the slavers. Fear of what was coming with those drums. "You don't understand what this looks like. His daughters, missing for 6 days, found wounded in the cabin of a white rancher." She paused, letting the implications sink in. "My father sent scouts to find us when we didn't return to winter camp. When they see us here, in your home, they won't ask questions first." "Your father?" Marcus asked, though he was beginning to understand. She met his eyes, and in the firelight he could see the weight of what she was about to tell him. "His name is Dakota Thunderhorse," she said quietly. "And when he arrives at dawn with every warrior he commands, he'll assume you took us. Some of our young scouts work for the army now, trying to keep peace between our peoples. They may have already told him we're here. He'll assume you're the reason we're hurt, and nothing I say will stop what happens next." Outside, the drums stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the noise had been. In that silence, Marcus could hear something new. The sound of hundreds of hooves moving through the darkness, surrounding his land like a noose tightening around a condemned man's neck. Marcus had heard the name before. Every settler within 500 miles had heard of Dakota Thunderhorse, the Apache chief who'd never lost a battle, the war leader who could put 400 warriors in the field and move them like a single weapon. The man who'd spent 15 years carving out Apache territory with blood and steel, making treaties with the U.S. Army on his own terms. And now that man was coming here, believing Marcus had harmed his daughters. The night dragged on like a wounded animal refusing to die. Marcus sat against the far wall, Winchester across his lap, while Ayanna kept watch by the door. Citlali had finally fallen into an uneasy sleep, her breathing steady but shallow. Neither Marcus nor Ayanna had spoken for over an hour. Outside, the sounds had settled into an eerie pattern. Horses moving in careful formations, men speaking in low voices, the creak of leather and jingle of metal that spoke of warriors checking weapons and preparing for battle. But no attack came. They were waiting. "Why dawn?" Marcus finally asked. Ayanna didn't look at him. "Our father believes the sun reveals truth. He'll want to see your face clearly when he judges you." "Judges me for what? Helping you?" "Judges you for being here when his daughters were found wounded." She shifted her position slightly, never taking her eyes off the door. 3 years ago, traders captured women from the Chiricahua band, sold them to brothels in Mexico. By the time our warriors found them, 2 were already dead. The trader claimed the women had come willingly, that he'd paid them fairly. Her voice went hard as winter stone. "My father doesn't make the same mistake twice." Marcus understood now. It didn't matter what had actually happened. What mattered was what it looked like. 2 Apache women wounded in the cabin of a white rancher. The story wrote itself, and the ending was written in blood. "You could leave," Ayanna said suddenly, "before dawn. Take your horse and ride south. Never look back. And leave you here to explain why you're in my cabin alone. We'd manage." "No," Marcus said flatly, "you wouldn't." She turned to look at him then. Really look at him, studying his face in the dying firelight. "You know what's coming. 400 warriors, maybe more. My father doesn't travel light when his daughters are in danger. You stay here, you die. There's no version of tomorrow where you survive this." "Maybe not," Marcus admitted, "but I'm not running." "Why bang?" Her voice carried genuine puzzlement in. "You don't know us. You owe us nothing. You could be in Colorado Springs by noon, alive and free." Marcus thought about that night 3 years ago, the night he'd come home to find his cabin burned, his wife and son gone. The neighbors who'd heard screams and done nothing because getting involved meant risk. The careful way they'd avoided his eyes at the burial, the hollow words of sympathy that meant less than nothing. "Because someone should have stayed," he said quietly. "Stayed for who?" "Doesn't matter now." He adjusted the rifle on his lap, checking the action one more time. "Tell me about your father. What kind of man is he?" Ayanna was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice carried something Marcus hadn't heard before. Pride. The kind who keeps his word, good or bad. The kind who'd ride through a blizzard to protect his people. The kind who taught his daughters to stand their ground and never beg for mercy. She paused, and her next words were softer. The kind who will give you one chance to explain before he decides your fate. One chance is better than none. Not if he doesn't believe you. Citlali stirred, mumbling something in her sleep. Ayanna immediately moved to her side, checking the bandage Marcus had applied, feeling her forehead for fever. The infection was retreating, but slowly. She'd live, assuming any of them survived the next few hours. "She'll be all right," Marcus said. "The wound's clean now." "Because of you," Ayanna said, looking at him over her shoulder. "That might be the only reason we survive tomorrow. But it won't be enough to save you." Marcus didn't respond. He'd made peace with worse odds before. During the war, he'd held a bridge against 50 Confederate cavalry with nothing but 12 men and determination. He'd tracked Comanche raiders across 200 miles of desert with no water and a wounded horse. He'd survived things that should have killed him and buried things that should have lived. But this felt different. This felt final. The hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. The fire burned low, casting long shadows across the cabin walls. Outside, the sounds gradually changed. Horses being moved into final positions. Men taking up formations they drilled 1,000 times. The organized movement of warriors who knew exactly what they were doing and had never failed to accomplish it. Then, as the first gray light began to seep through the cracks in the walls, everything went completely silent. Ayanna stood up slowly, her entire body tense as a bowstring. "He's here." Marcus rose to his feet and set his rifle against the wall. If Dakota Thunderhorse wanted him dead, a single weapon wouldn't make any difference. But the gesture might. He walked to the door, took a deep breath of the cold morning air, and opened it wide. The sight that greeted him stole the breath from his lungs. The entire valley was filled with Apache warriors. They stretched back as far as he could see in the dim morning light, a living wall of muscle and steel that seemed to cover every inch of his land. 400 men, maybe more. Everyone armed and mounted, every horse trained for battle, every eye fixed on his small cabin. And at the front, sitting motionless on a white Mustang, was a figure of commanding presence. His ceremonial headdress of eagle feathers caught the first rays of sunlight, and beneath them, a face that had seen too much and forgotten nothing. Dakota Thunderhorse had arrived, and the sun was beginning to rise over a day that would end in either justice or massacre. Marcus had no idea which it would be. The morning sun cast long shadows across the blood-stained snow as Marcus faced the most formidable sight of his military career. 400 Apache warriors filled his valley like an ocean of steel and determination. Every man armed, every horse trained for war, every eye fixed on his cabin with the intensity of predators sizing up prey. And at the center of it all, Dakota Thunderhorse sat motionless on his white Mustang, his elaborate headdress creating an imposing silhouette against the morning sky. Even from this distance, Marcus could feel the weight of his presence. This wasn't just a leader. This was a man who commanded respect through something deeper than fear. Behind Marcus, he heard movement. Ayanna appeared in the doorway supporting her sister. Sitlali could barely stand, but she was conscious now, her eyes clearer than they had been all night. "Stay inside," Marcus said without turning. "No," Ayanna's voice was firm. "He needs to see us, needs to see we're alive and unharmed." She was right, Marcus realized. If Dakota thought his daughters were being held captive, there'd be no conversation. Just violence, swift and terrible. The three of them stepped onto the porch together, Marcus in the center, the two women flanking him like living proof of his intentions. The moment the warrior saw the women, a sound rippled through their ranks. Not relief exactly, something more complicated. Recognition mixed with confusion, questions that would need answers. Dakota raised one hand and the sound stopped instantly. 400 voices silenced by a single gesture. Then the war chief dismounted, his movements deliberate and controlled. He didn't rush forward, didn't shout commands or demands. He simply began walking toward the cabin with the kind of certainty that comes from never having been proven wrong. As he got closer, Marcus could see his face clearly. Weathered by 55 years of frontier life, yes, but not cruel. The lines around his eyes spoke of a man who'd seen too much, lost too much, but hadn't let it break him. His gaze moved over the scene with brutal efficiency, taking in details that would determine whether the sun set on a peaceful resolution or a massacre. His daughters, wrapped in a single blanket, standing on their own feet. The clean bandage visible on Sitlali's side, properly tied and showing no signs of rough treatment. The open door behind them, suggesting shelter freely given rather than imprisonment. And Marcus himself standing there in just his shirt despite the morning cold, clearly having given away his only protection against the bitter mountain air. 20 feet separated them now, father and stranger, war chief and rancher. The distance felt like a canyon that might be bridged with the right words, or might swallow them all if the wrong ones were spoken. "You are the one who lives here," Dakota said finally. Not a question, a statement delivered in a voice that carried like thunder even though he wasn't shouting. "I am," Marcus replied, keeping his own voice steady and respectful. "My daughters were found on your land." They were. One of them is wounded. She was when I found them. Dakota took 3 steps closer, close enough now that Marcus could see the scars on his hands, the calluses that spoke of a lifetime holding weapons. The war chief's eyes moved from Marcus to his daughters and back again. Men hurt them, Dakota continued, his voice carrying the weight of accumulated rage held carefully in check. Men who wanted to take them, sell them like horses or cattle. His eyes narrowed and Marcus felt the full force of that legendary stare. Were you one of those men? The question hung in the morning air like smoke from a rifle shot. Marcus knew that how he answered in the next few seconds would determine whether he saw another sunset. 400 warriors waited for his response, hands resting on weapons, ready to paint the valley red at their chief's command. No, Marcus said simply. Then why are they here? It was the question everything depended on. The question that would either save his life or end it. Marcus felt the weight of those pale blue eyes, felt the accumulated grief and rage of a father who'd seen too much suffering inflicted on those he loved. Because they were dying, he said, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. And I had a blanket they needed. Dakota's gaze shifted to the wool blanket wrapped around his daughters, then back to Marcus's bare arms. Understanding flickered across his weathered features, but he didn't soften. Not yet. You gave them your only protection against the cold, Dakota said, statement rather than question. Yes. We. It was the same question Ayanna had asked, and Marcus gave the same answer, the only one that mattered. Because nobody else would. Dakota studied him in silence, and Marcus could almost see the war chief's mind working, weighing evidence, testing the story against his knowledge of men and their motivations. Then Dakota turned to Ayanna and spoke rapidly in Apache, his voice sharp with questions that demanded honest answers. Ayanna responded, her voice steady and clear, maintaining eye contact with her father as she spoke. Marcus couldn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. She was defending him, telling the truth about what had happened in the cabin, about the care he'd shown and the risks he'd taken. When she finished, Sitlali spoke next, her voice weaker but no less determined. She gestured to her bandaged side, spoke of fever breaking and wounds healing, of gentle hands and careful treatment. Her father listened without interrupting, his granite expression giving away nothing. Finally, the testimonies ended. Dakota turned back to Marcus, and the silence stretched between them like a taut bowstring ready to snap. My daughters say you saved their lives, Dakota said slowly. They say you asked for nothing, expected nothing, that you treated their wounds and shared your warmth. He paused, and when he continued, his voice carried a different note. They also say you knew I would come, that you could have fled but chose to stay. Marcus waited. There was more coming. Why would a man do that? Dakota asked. Why would a white man risk certain death for 2 Apache women he'd never seen before? The answer came from somewhere deep, somewhere Marcus hadn't looked in years. Because running doesn't change what happened, and I'm tired of running from what's right. Dakota held his gaze for what felt like forever. Then slowly, deliberately, he reached for something at his belt. Marcus's entire body tensed, every muscle preparing for whatever came next. Behind him, he heard Ayanna shift her weight, ready to intervene if her father made the wrong choice. But Dakota didn't draw a weapon. Instead, he pulled out a small leather pouch and held it in his palm, studying it like it contained something infinitely precious. When I was young, Dakota said, his voice quieter now, carrying pain that had been carefully hidden for decades, I watched my sister freeze to death in the mountains. We had been running from cavalry for 3 days. No food, no shelter, no blankets. He paused, the memory clearly painful even after all these years. A white man found us, a trader with supplies, warm clothes, food enough to keep us alive. He could have helped. He had everything we needed. Marcus said nothing. There was nothing to say. Instead, he rode past without stopping. Dakota continued, his voice growing harder. Said it wasn't his problem. Said he couldn't risk helping savage Indians, even a dying girl. The war chief's hand closed around the pouch, knuckles white with the force of old grief. I carried my sister's body for 2 days to bury her properly. Her name was Morningstar, and she was 15 years old. She died because a man with the power to save her chose to look away. Marcus felt the weight of that story, the decades of pain and anger it represented. He began to understand why Dakota had come with 400 warriors, why the sight of his daughters in a white man's cabin had triggered such a massive response. I swore that day that I would never forget what it means when someone chooses to turn away, Dakota said. But I also swore I would never forget if someone chose differently. He took another step forward, close enough now that Marcus could see the lines grief had carved around his eyes, close enough that if Dakota wanted to strike, there would be no time to react. You are not the man who rode past my sister, Dakota said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute judgment. You are the man I wished had been there that day. The words hung in the air between them like a bridge spanning decades of hatred and mistrust. Behind Dakota, 400 warriors remained perfectly still, waiting for their chief's command. The morning sun climbed higher, painting the snow-covered valley in shades of gold and crimson. Dakota opened the leather pouch and pulled out something wrapped in soft doeskin. He unfolded it carefully, revealing a carved piece of turquoise on a leather cord, simple but clearly meaningful, polished by generations of hands. This belonged to my father, Dakota said, and his father before him. It is given only to those who prove themselves worthy of trust, worthy of the protection of our people. He held it out and Marcus stared at the offered gift, understanding the magnitude of what was happening. This wasn't just gratitude. This was adoption, alliance, a bond that would extend far beyond this moment. I can't take that, Marcus said. It belongs to your family. You can and you will, Dakota replied, his voice leaving no room for argument. Because when you wear this, my people will know you are under our protection. Any harm that comes to you will be answered as if it were harm done to my own blood. He stepped forward and placed the cord around Marcus's neck himself, the turquoise settling against Marcus's chest, warm from the war chief's hand. You gave my daughters your only blanket, Dakota said, knowing what it might cost you. That is the action of a man with honor. He stepped back, and Marcus saw something in his expression that might have been the shadow of a smile. From this day forward, you are welcome among our people. Your home is under our protection, and if you ever need help, you send word, and it will come. Marcus touched the stone, still processing what had just happened. The weight of it against his chest felt like more than carved rock. It felt like redemption. I didn't do it for this, Marcus said. I know, Dakota replied. That is exactly why you deserve it. But even as the moment of understanding passed between them, Marcus heard something that made his blood run cold. The sound of horses approaching fast from the south. Many horses moving with military precision. Dakota heard it too. His expression hardened instantly. The moment of peace shattering like glass. He barked orders in Apache, and instantly his warriors began moving into defensive positions, weapons appearing in hands with fluid efficiency. Who comes? Marcus asked, though he feared he already knew. Soldiers, Ayanna said, moving to her father's side. 30, maybe 40, moving fast. The dust cloud appeared over the southern ridge moments before the riders themselves came into view. U.S. cavalry, Marcus realized, recognizing the formation and the way they sat their horses. At their head rode an officer in captain's bars, a man Marcus recognized with a sinking heart. Captain James Reynolds, 3rd Colorado Cavalry, a by-the-book soldier with political ambitions and no love for Apache people. If Reynolds was here, it meant someone had told him about the situation, and that someone almost certainly had their own agenda. The cavalry force pulled up just outside rifle range, 32 men with carbines and sidearms, vastly outnumbered but representing the authority of the United States government. Reynolds rode forward alone, stopping halfway between the two forces. Chief Dakota, he called, his voice carrying clearly across the snow. I am Captain Reynolds, 3rd Colorado Cavalry. I'm here under orders from the territorial government. Dakota said nothing, but Marcus could see the war chief's jaw tighten. This was exactly the kind of confrontation that could spiral into the bloodshed both sides claimed to want to avoid. Reynolds continued, his voice taking on the tone of official authority. You are in violation of federal law by removing your people from the designated reservation. I order you to surrender the Apache women in that cabin and the criminal who has been harboring them. The word criminal hit Marcus like a physical blow. So that was how this would be played. Helping injured women became harboring fugitives. Offering shelter became a federal crime. Furthermore, Reynolds said, his voice growing stronger, you will return to the reservation immediately or face the consequences of your actions. The threat hung in the morning air like the smell of gunpowder. Dakota's warriors shifted restlessly, hands moving to weapons, horses sensing their riders' tension. 400 Apache warriors against 30 cavalry. The outcome was certain, but the cost would be measured in blood and political consequences that could destroy any chance of peace. Marcus stepped forward, knowing he was about to insert himself into a confrontation that could end with his death, but unable to remain silent. Captain Reynolds, he called, his voice carrying the authority of his former rank. These women were injured and needed medical attention. Providing aid to wounded people isn't a crime under any law I know. Reynolds turned his attention to Marcus, and there was something in the captain's eyes that Marcus didn't like, something that looked almost like satisfaction. Sergeant Thornfield, Reynolds said, using Marcus's old military rank, you are under arrest for violation of federal statutes regarding the harboring of federal prisoners. Federal prisoners? Marcus's voice sharpened. These are free women who were attacked by slavers. These are wards of the federal government who left the reservation without permission. Reynolds shot back. That makes them fugitives, and anyone who aids them a criminal. Marcus felt the legal trap closing around him. In the tangled web of federal Indian law, Reynolds might actually be technically correct. The legal status of Apache people was deliberately complex, designed to give officials maximum flexibility in interpretation. But before the confrontation could escalate further, a new sound reached them. The thunder of many more horses approaching from the east at a gallop. Not cavalry this time, but riders in civilian clothes, moving with a kind of desperate speed that spoke of men fleeing something terrible. The new arrivals burst into view over the eastern ridge, a ragged group of perhaps 12 men on lathered horses. Even at a distance, Marcus could see they were hard men, the kind who made their living on the wrong side of the law. And at their head rode a figure that made Ayanna gasp, and Sitlali stepped closer to her sister. The man in the lead was massive, easily 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders like an ox and a face that had been split from ear to mouth by some old knife fight. The scar gave him a perpetual sneer that matched the cruelty in his pale eyes. Jeremiah Baxter, Ayanna whispered, her voice tight with fear and rage. The man who tried to capture us. Behind Baxter rode the rest of his gang, slave traders who specialized in human cargo. Men who saw Apache women as nothing more than valuable merchandise to be bought and sold. They were heavily armed and clearly desperate, probably driven to this confrontation by the knowledge that their time was running out. What Marcus couldn't understand was why they were here at all. Attacking an Apache war party was suicide. No amount of money was worth facing 400 warriors in open combat. Then he saw the man riding beside Baxter, and everything became clear. It was another Apache, but one whose presence made Dakota's expression darken with murderous rage. Isaiah Crowkiller, Dakota said, the name coming out like a curse. Exile. Traitor. Marcus understood now. Isaiah knew Apache tactics, knew their strengths and weaknesses. With his guidance, Baxter might believe he could create enough chaos to snatch the two women and escape before organized resistance could form. It was a desperate plan, probably doomed to failure, but desperate men often made desperate choices. The three forces formed a rough triangle in the valley, each watching the others, each waiting for someone to make the first move. Cavalry to the south, Apache warriors spread across the center and north, slave traders to the east. And in the middle, Marcus's cabin, with three people whose choices in the next few minutes would determine whether this ended in justice or massacre. Reynolds was the first to break the tense silence. Baxter, he called, his voice carrying clearly across the valley. You're under arrest for violation of federal statutes. Surrender your weapons and submit to custody. Baxter's laugh was harsh and mocking. Captain, you've got bigger problems than chasing bounty hunters. That's 400 hostiles you're facing, in case you can't count that high. The implication was clear and ugly. In Baxter's mind, all Apache were hostiles by definition, their presence off the reservation an act of war. It was the kind of thinking that had led to massacres and broken treaties, the reduction of complex human beings to simple categories of friend or enemy. Chief Dakota, Baxter called. his voice taking on a false note of reasonable. I've got a legal claim to those women. Federal bounty for the return of reservation escapees. You interfere with that, you're breaking United States law. Dakota's response was to signal his warriors. In a movement so fluid it seemed choreographed, 400 men raised weapons and took aim at the slave traders. The message was unmistakable. But before anyone could fire, Isaiah Crowkiller spurred his horse forward, positioning himself where all three forces could hear him clearly. Dakota Thunderhorse, he called, using the formal address of tribal diplomacy. I claim the right of challenge. You wronged me. You cast me out for speaking truth about the white man's promises. Now your daughters pay the price for your stubbornness. The words hit Dakota like physical blows. Marcus could see the war chief's entire body tense, could see the rage building behind his carefully controlled expression. You were exiled for selling our people to slavers, Dakota replied, his voice carrying across the valley like the rumble of distant thunder. For betraying women and children to men like him. He gestured toward Baxter with contempt that needed no translation. I was exiled for telling uncomfortable truths, Isaiah shot back. For saying that accommodation was better than extinction. For recognizing that the white man's victory was inevitable. It was an old argument, Marcus realized. The eternal debate among conquered peoples about resistance versus surrender, about maintaining honor versus ensuring survival. Isaiah represented those who believed accommodation with white authority was the only path to tribal continuance. Dakota represented those who would rather die free than live as prisoners. But the philosophical debate was about to become irrelevant because Baxter was clearly growing impatient with talk. His men were spreading out, taking positions that would give them maximum firepower while minimizing their exposure to return fire. They were outnumbered 30-1, but they had the advantage of surprise and desperation. Marcus made his choice. Captain Reynolds, he called, his voice carrying the authority of his old military training. Those men are slave traders who attacked federal territory. They're the criminals here, not the Apache. You have no authority here, Thornfield, Reynolds replied, but there was uncertainty in his voice. The situation was spiraling beyond any simple legal resolution. Maybe not, Marcus said, stepping forward to place himself directly between the three forces. But I have something to say that all of you need to hear. The valley fell silent except for the whisper of wind through pine trees and the nervous movement of horses. Every eye was on Marcus as he stood alone in the middle of what was about to become a battlefield. 6 days ago, Marcus said, his voice carrying clearly in the thin mountain air, these two women were attacked by slave traders while gathering medicine herbs. They fought free, killing two of their attackers, and ran for 6 days through hostile territory with one of them badly wounded. He gestured towards Hitlali, who stood straighter despite her obvious pain. When they reached my cabin, they were dying. So I gave them shelter, medical attention, and the only blanket I had, because that's what decent people do when others need help. Marcus turned to face Reynolds directly. Captain, if helping injured women is a crime, then I'm guilty. But if it's not, then you need to decide who the real criminals are here. Then he turned to Baxter and his voice went hard as winter stone. And you want to claim these women as property? You want to drag them back to whatever hell you had planned for them? You'll have to go through me first. Finally, he turned to face Dakota, and his voice softened with something that might have been respect. Chief, your daughters are brave and strong. They honor your teachings, and they're free to go wherever they choose, whenever they choose. That's what freedom means. The silence that followed was so complete that Marcus could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. Three forces, each with their own agenda, each convinced of their own righteousness. And somewhere in that maze of competing interests, a decision would be made that would determine not just his own fate, but the fate of everyone in the valley. Then Baxter made the choice for all of them. Enough talk, he snarled, and spurred his horse toward the cabin, his men following with weapons drawn. The valley exploded into violence. Baxter's war cry cut through the morning air like a blade, his massive frame hunched low over his horse's neck as he charged toward the cabin. His 11 men followed, spreading out in a ragged line, their weapons glinting in the pale sunlight. They moved with the desperate fury of men who knew this was their last chance. But they had underestimated the Apache. Dakota's warriors responded with the fluid precision of water flowing downhill. Without a single shouted command, they split into three groups, moving to encircle the attackers while maintaining clear fields of fire. Their horses seemed to dance across the snow, hooves finding purchase on ground that would have sent lesser riders tumbling. Captain Reynolds, caught between his duty to maintain order and his survival instinct, made his own choice. "Defensive positions," he shouted to his men. "Protect the civilians." Whether he meant Marcus and the Apache women or was simply trying to justify not engaging with 400 hostile warriors didn't matter. His 30 cavalry troopers dismounted and took cover behind whatever they could find, carbines ready but not yet aimed at any specific target. Marcus had perhaps 3 seconds to make his own decision. Stay on the porch and likely catch a bullet meant for someone else, or get into the fight and maybe influence its outcome. He'd been a soldier long enough to know that battles were usually won by the side that made fewer mistakes, not the one with superior numbers. He dove off the porch just as Baxter's first shot shattered the window behind him. The slaver's bullet gouged splinters from the cabin wall where Marcus's head had been a heartbeat before. Baxter was shouting something, but his words were lost in the thunder of hooves and the sharp crack of rifles as the various forces opened fire on each other. Marcus rolled through the snow and came up behind the woodpile he'd stacked just yesterday. Amazing how normal activities like chopping wood could become life-saving cover when the shooting started. He checked his Navy Colt, grateful he'd had the foresight to keep it loaded. Across the valley, Apache warriors were demonstrating why they'd held this territory for generations. They moved like ghosts, appearing from behind trees and rocks, to loose arrows with deadly precision, then vanishing before return fire could find them. 3 of Baxter's men were already down, their horses riderless and panicking. But the slavers weren't going down easy. These were hard men who'd survived years of violent work, and they knew how to fight. Jeremiah Baxter himself was bearing down on the cabin with the single-minded fury of a man who saw his fortune slipping away. Behind him, Isaiah Crowkiller was shouting directions in Apache, trying to use his knowledge of tribal tactics against his own people. The sound that followed would haunt Marcus for the rest of his life. Isaiah's voice, speaking the sacred language of his birth, but twisted into betrayal. Telling the slavers where Apache warriors would likely take cover, how they would move, where they were most vulnerable. Dakota heard it too. The war chief's face contorted with rage that went beyond mere anger into something primal and terrible. He spurred his white Mustang directly toward Isaiah, war club appearing in his hand as if by magic. "Traitor!" Dakota's voice carried across the battlefield like the roar of an avalanche. "Face me!" Isaiah accepted the challenge, wheeling his horse to meet his former chief. The 2 men crashed together with bone-jarring force, war clubs ringing against each other like church bells tolling death. Around them, the battle raged on, but for a moment it seemed as if the entire conflict had narrowed to these 2 men and the fundamental question of loyalty versus survival. Meanwhile, Baxter had reached the cabin porch. The massive slaver dismounted with surprising grace for such a large man, his scarred face twisted into something that might have been a grin. In his hands was a sawed-off shotgun that could turn a man into hamburger at close range. Come out, little Apache girls," he called, his voice a mockery of nursery rhyme sweetness. "Uncle Jeremiah has a nice warm place waiting for you in Mexico." That was when Marcus made his second decision of the day. He rose from behind the woodpile and put a .36 caliber ball through Baxter's left shoulder. The impact spun the big man around but didn't drop him. Baxter's return shot with the shotgun missed Marcus by inches, blowing chunks of pine bark into the air where his head had been. But the slaver's follow-up shot went wide as his wounded shoulder refused to function properly. Marcus was already moving, reloading as he ran toward the cabin. Behind him, he could hear Ayanna shouting something in Apache, probably telling her sister to get inside and bar the door. Good thinking. Whatever happened next, the wounded woman didn't need to be in the middle of it. Baxter met him at the porch steps, the scarred slaver having switched to a wicked-looking blade that bore the marks of violent work. Up close, Marcus could see that the man's famous scar wasn't from a knife fight at all, but from a saber cut that had probably been meant to take his head clean off. Someone had tried very hard to kill Jeremiah Baxter and failed. Marcus wondered if he was about to join that unfortunate list. The knife came at him in a sweeping arc meant to open his belly from hip to hip. Marcus threw himself backward, feeling the blade whisper past his shirt buttons. His return thrust with his own knife caught Baxter in the ribs, but the slaver's heavy coat turned what should have been a killing blow into a shallow cut. They circled each other on the narrow porch, breath steaming in the cold air, each looking for an opening. Baxter had the reach advantage and the experience, but Marcus had something the slaver didn't. He had a reason to fight that went beyond money. Every time he looked at this man, Marcus saw the faces of every woman and child who'd been dragged away in chains, saw the families torn apart by men who saw human beings as nothing more than profitable cargo. He thought of Sarah and Thomas, dead because they'd witnessed Morrison's corruption. He thought of Morning Star, Dakota's sister, dead because a white man had chosen to look away. Enough looking away. Enough letting evil men profit from other people's misery. Marcus feinted left, then dove right as Baxter's knife swept through the space where he had been. He came up inside the big man's reach, close enough to smell the whiskey on his breath, close enough to see the cruel intelligence in his pale eyes. The pommel of Marcus's knife caught Baxter just below the ear, a blow that would have dropped most men. The slaver staggered but stayed upright, his own blade coming around in a backhand slice that opened Marcus's cheek to the bone. Blood ran hot down Marcus's face as he staggered back, giving Baxter room to recover. The slaver grinned, showing teeth stained yellow with tobacco. "You picked the wrong side, soldier boy," Baxter panted. "Should have minded your own business." "Story of my life," Marcus replied, and launched himself forward. They went down together, rolling off the porch into the snow, each man trying to drive his blade home. Marcus ended up on top, his knife poised above Baxter's throat, but the slaver's grip on his wrist was like iron. For a moment they remained frozen, muscles straining, the outcome balanced on the edge of a knife. Then Baxter made his final mistake. He tried to knee Marcus in the groin, but the angle was wrong, and all he accomplished was to shift his weight at exactly the wrong moment. Marcus's blade found its mark, sliding between ribs to pierce the heart that had never known mercy. Baxter's eyes went wide with surprise, then vacant with death. The scarred slaver who'd terrorized the frontier for a decade died in the snow outside a lonely cabin, his blood steaming in the cold mountain air. Marcus rolled away from the corpse, gasping for breath, his cheeks still bleeding freely. Around him, the battle was winding down. Most of Baxter's men were dead or dying, cut down by Apache arrows or trampled by war horses. The few survivors were trying to surrender to Reynolds' cavalry, probably figuring a military prison was better than whatever the Apache had planned for them. Dakota and Isaiah were still fighting, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The war chief was younger, stronger, and fighting for something more important than money. Isaiah's betrayal had given him tactical advantages, but it hadn't changed the fundamental reality that he was a traitor facing the chief he'd sworn to serve. The end came suddenly. Isaiah overextended on a desperate swing, and Dakota's war club caved in the side of his skull with a sound like a melon hitting stone. The exile fell from his horse and lay still in the trampled snow. His treachery finally ended. Dakota wheeled his Mustang and surveyed the battlefield. 11 slavers lay dead or dying. 3 Apache warriors had been wounded, but none killed. Reynolds' cavalry had taken no casualties, having wisely chosen to focus on the slavers rather than the Apache. The war chief's gaze found Marcus, standing over Baxter's body with blood still streaming down his face. For a moment, their eyes met across the carnage, and something passed in between them that needed no words. Then Dakota raised his war club high above his head and let loose a victory cry that echoed off the mountain peaks like thunder. His warriors took up the call, 400 voices joining in a sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. The Battle of Thornfield Valley was over. The question now was what would come next. Captain Reynolds approached slowly, his hands visible and empty, his 30 men trailing behind him with their weapons lowered but ready. The captain's face was pale beneath his campaign hat, probably realizing how close he'd come to starting a war that would have cost hundreds of lives. "Chief Dakota," Reynolds called when he was close enough to be heard without shouting, "I believe there's been a misunderstanding here." Dakota's expression was unreadable as he studied the cavalry officer. "Speak." "These men," Reynolds gestured toward the dead slavers, "were criminals operating outside the law. If you and your people were pursuing them to recover your stolen daughters, then you were acting within your rights under the Treaty of Sacred Springs. Marcus could almost see the political calculations running through Reynolds' mind. A massacre of Apache civilians would bring unwanted scrutiny from Washington. But a legitimate police action against slave traders? That was something the newspapers could celebrate. Furthermore, Reynolds continued, any assistance provided to the victims of these criminals was both legal and commendable. The captain's gaze found Marcus, and there was something approaching respect in his expression. Sergeant Thornfield acted with honor in protecting non-combatants from criminal assault. It was a face-saving formula that allowed everyone to walk away from this confrontation without further bloodshed. Dakota could claim victory over his enemies. Reynolds could report successful cooperation with friendly Apache forces, and Marcus could continue breathing, which was really all he'd hoped for when this day started. But Dakota wasn't quite finished. What of the men who sent these criminals? The ones who profit from the trade in human flesh? Reynolds' expression hardened. If you have evidence of such men, Chief Dakota, the United States Army would be very interested in hearing it. Then we will speak again, Dakota said simply, when the evidence is gathered. The war chief dismounted and walked toward Marcus, his warriors forming a respectful circle around them. Up close, Marcus could see that Dakota bore his own wounds from the fight with Isaiah, a cut on his forehead that had bled down into his war paint, making him look even more fearsome than usual. You fought well, Dakota said, studying Marcus's injured face. But you are hurt. I'll live, Marcus replied, thanks to your daughter's medical skills. As if summoned by his words, Ayana appeared from the cabin carrying a basin of water and clean cloth. Sitlali followed more slowly, still favoring her wounded side but moving under her own power. Sit, Ayana commanded, pointing to the porch steps. That cut needs cleaning before it festers. Marcus sat, grateful for the chance to rest. The adrenaline of battle was fading, leaving behind aches and pains he hadn't noticed while fighting for his life. Ayana began cleaning his wound with the same gentle efficiency she'd shown caring for her sister. You could have been killed, she said quietly, her voice carrying something that might have been concern. Could have been killed staying out of it too, Marcus pointed out. At least this way, I got to choose how to die. Dakota laughed, a sound like distant thunder. Spoken like a warrior. You understand honor. The war chief reached into his medicine bag and withdrew the turquoise pendant he'd offered earlier. You refused this before. Will you refuse it again after proving yourself in battle? Marcus looked at the carved stone, understanding its significance even more clearly now. This wasn't just jewelry, it was a symbol of belonging, of acceptance into a family that had every reason to hate men who looked like him. I'm honored, Marcus said simply, bowing his head so Dakota could place the leather cord around his neck. The stone settled against his chest, next to Sarah's wedding ring that hung on a chain beneath his shirt. Old love and new brotherhood resting together over his heart. You are blood of our blood now, Dakota said formally. Brother who shares warmth, you will always have a place at our fires. The ceremony was interrupted by the approach of a young Apache warrior who'd been serving as a scout. He spoke rapidly to Dakota in their native language, his words causing the war chief's expression to darken. What is it? Marcus asked. My scout brings news from the north, Dakota said grimly. A large force of soldiers is moving toward our winter camp. More than cavalry, infantry with artillery. Marcus felt cold dread settle in his stomach. How many? Too many for our winter warriors to fight alone, Dakota admitted. And they are led by a colonel who has sworn to drive all Apache from this territory. Colonel Morrison, Captain Reynolds said quietly, having overheard the conversation. The captain's face was pale with understanding. He's been requesting additional troops for months, claiming Apache raids were increasing. What raids? Dakota demanded. My people have kept the peace treaty. We hunt only on our traditional grounds, trade fairly with honest merchants. I know, Reynolds said, and there was genuine regret in his voice. But Morrison claims you're sheltering the very criminals we just killed here. He says this attack proves Apache are working with slave traders. The political trap became clear. Morrison had probably been planning this operation for months, waiting for an excuse to justify a massive military action against the Apache. The slaver attack this morning wasn't random timing. It was meant to provide that excuse, regardless of the outcome. If the slavers had succeeded in capturing Ayana and Sitlali, Morrison would claim the Apache were too weak to protect their own people and needed federal supervision. If the slavers failed, he'd claim the Apache were working with criminals and needed to be pacified. Either way, Morrison got his war. "How long before he reaches your people?" Marcus asked. "2 days, maybe 3 if the weather holds," Dakota replied. "Not long enough to evacuate the elders and children to safety." Marcus looked around at the aftermath of the morning's battle. Dead slavers in the snow, wounded Apache warriors binding their cuts with stoic pride, cavalry troopers who just fought alongside the very people their government wanted them to destroy. An idea began forming in his mind, desperate and probably hopeless, but maybe their only chance. What if Morrison didn't have an excuse for his war? Marcus asked slowly. What if instead of Apache raiders, he found Apache allies? Dakota studied him intently. "Explain." "Captain Reynolds," Marcus said, turning to the cavalry officer, "do you believe the Apache were working with those slavers?" Reynolds looked at the carnage around them, at the dead criminals and the wounded but victorious Apache warriors. "No, I believe they were hunting the men who attacked their people, as any father would." "Then you could report that to your superiors. Tell them the Apache provided valuable assistance in eliminating a criminal organization that was operating in federal territory." "I could," Reynolds said carefully, "but Morrison outranks me. He could override my report." "Not if there were witnesses," Marcus said. "Federal witnesses, civilian witnesses, people with no military chain of command to worry about." He was thinking out loud now, the plan taking shape as he spoke. What if we could prove Morrison's been protecting the slavers? What if we could show he's been taking money to look the other way while they operate? "That would be treason," Reynolds said quietly. "Yes, it would," Marcus agreed, "and it would explain why he's so eager to silence anyone who might have evidence against him." Dakota's eyes were beginning to gleam with understanding. "You are suggesting we hunt the hunters. I'm suggesting we gather evidence before Morrison can destroy it. Find proof of his involvement with the slave trade. Present it to authorities who can't ignore it." "And where would we find such evidence?" Ayanna asked, having finished bandaging Marcus's cheek. Marcus smiled grimly, touching the turquoise pendant at his throat. "I spent 8 years in the army, fighting beside men like Reynolds here. Good soldiers who believe in duty and honor. But I also served under men like Morrison. Corrupt officers who see their rank as licensed to profit from other people's misery." He looked around at the mixed group of Apache warriors and cavalry troopers, natural enemies who just fought side by side against a common threat. Men like Morrison always keep records, evidence of their deals, proof of their profits. They think it protects them, gives them leverage over their partners. But it can also destroy them if the right people see it. "You're talking about raiding a U.S. Army installation," Reynolds pointed out. "That's an act of war." "No," Marcus said. "I'm talking about loyal soldiers investigating corruption in their ranks, with civilian assistance from people who have been harmed by that corruption." He stood up, testing his weight on legs that still felt shaky from the fight. "Captain, how many of your men do you trust completely?" Reynolds considered the question seriously. "All of them when it comes to fighting. Maybe half of them when it comes to standing up to a superior officer who might ruin their careers." "That's enough," Marcus said. "We don't need an army. We need a small force that can move fast and strike hard." Dakota nodded slowly. "My warriors know the country. We can guide soldiers safely to Morrison's stronghold." "And then?" Reynolds asked. Marcus touched the pendant again, feeling its weight against his chest. "Then we find out once and for all who the real criminals are in this territory." The sun was climbing higher now, melting the snow where it struck the ground. Around them, warriors and soldiers were tending their wounded and gathering their gear. The morning's battle was over, but Marcus could feel the approaching storm of something much larger. Colonel Morrison had wanted a war. He was about to get one, just not the kind he'd been planning. 2 days, Dakota said, reading his thoughts. "We have 2 days to save my people and end this corruption." Marcus nodded, already planning their next moves. 2 days to find evidence, expose the truth, and prevent a massacre. 2 days to prove that honor and justice could still triumph over greed and hatred. 2 days to save everything that mattered. It would have to be enough. 2 days. That's all they had to prevent a massacre and expose the corruption that threatened to destroy everything Dakota's people had built in their mountain sanctuary. As the sun climbed higher over the blood-stained snow, Marcus found himself at the center of an alliance that would have been unthinkable just 24 hours earlier. Apache warriors and U.S. cavalry soldiers moved together with newfound cooperation, tending wounds and sharing rations, while their leaders planned what amounted to a military operation against their own commanding officer. It was treason by any legal definition, but sometimes the law and justice pointed in different directions. Captain Reynolds had sent a coded message to his most trusted sergeants at Fort Collins, asking them to gather intelligence on Colonel Morrison's recent activities. The response, delivered by a hard-riding trooper just before noon, confirmed their worst suspicions. Morrison's been meeting with civilian contractors, Reynolds read from the dispatch, his voice tight with controlled anger. Large payments authorized for specialized reconnaissance services. No official record of what services were provided. Specialized reconnaissance, Dakota repeated, the Apache words for such deception carrying a tone of profound disgust. Pretty name for slave hunting. Marcus studied the map Reynolds had spread on a makeshift table formed by stacking supply crates. Fort Collins sat in a valley 30 miles north, its position chosen to control the main routes between Apache territory and the Colorado settlements. Under normal circumstances, it would take a full day's hard riding to reach it. But these weren't normal circumstances. There's another problem, Reynolds continued. Morrison's been requesting additional troops from Denver. Claims he needs them for a final solution to the Apache problem. If those reinforcements arrive before we can expose him, he didn't need to finish. Everyone understood the implications. Morrison with additional troops would be unstoppable. His corruption protected by superior firepower and political backing from territorial authorities who wanted Apache land open for development. How many men does he have now? Marcus asked. 200 infantry, 50 cavalry, and a battery of mountain howitzers, Reynolds replied grimly, plus whatever civilians he's hired. Dakota studied the map, his weathered fingers tracing the mountain paths his people had used for generations. We know these trails. We can move faster than soldiers weighed down with supplies and heavy weapons. But can we move quietly? Marcus asked. Morrison's no fool. He'll have scouts watching all the approaches. Apache scouts, Ayanna said, joining the conversation. Her wounded sister Sitlali walked beside her, moving slowly but steadily. The medicine woman's recovery had been remarkable, testament to both her own strength and Marcus's field surgery. Some of our young men work for the Army. They may not know what Morrison truly plans. It was a complication Marcus hadn't considered. How do you fight an enemy who might be using your own people as his eyes and ears, especially when those people believe they were serving their tribe's best interests by cooperating with federal authorities? We need to reach them first, Marcus decided. Convince them that Morrison isn't who they think he is. And how do we do that? Reynolds asked. Marcus touched the turquoise pendant hanging around his neck, feeling its weight against his chest. 2 days ago, he'd been a solitary rancher with no family, no connections, no obligations beyond his own survival. Now he was part of something larger, something that demanded he risk everything to protect people who'd become more than allies. They'd become family. We tell them the truth, Marcus said simply, and we show them the evidence. The plan they developed over the next hour was audacious, bordering on suicidal. A joint force of 20 Apache warriors and 15 cavalry troopers would approach Fort Collins from 3 directions, moving through country so difficult that Morrison would never expect an attack from those quarters. Reynolds would enter the fort openly, claiming to be delivering his report on the morning's battle. Meanwhile, Marcus and Dakota would infiltrate Morrison's quarters to search for the evidence that would prove his corruption. And if we're caught, Reynolds asked quietly, then we fight, Dakota said matter-of-factly. Better to die striking at evil than to live watching it triumph. Marcus found himself nodding agreement. 3 days ago, such thinking would have seemed like romantic nonsense. But something had changed in him during the long night of tending wounded women and facing down overwhelming odds. Perhaps it was the weight of the pendant against his chest. Perhaps it was the memory of Sarah's voice telling him to do what was right regardless of the cost. Or perhaps it was simply that some fights were worth having, even if you couldn't win them. They moved out at dusk, traveling in small groups to avoid detection. Marcus rode beside Dakota, marveling at the war chief's ability to find paths through country that looked impassable even in daylight. Behind them, Apache warriors and cavalry troopers followed in single file, natural enemies united by common purpose and mutual respect earned through shared combat. The temperature dropped steadily as they climbed into the high country, forcing them to muffle their horses' hooves with strips of cloth to prevent the sound of iron shoes on frozen stone from carrying across the mountain valleys. By midnight, they were moving through a landscape so harsh and beautiful, it seemed to belong to another world entirely. Marcus had campaigned in difficult terrain before, but nothing had prepared him for this. The Apache moved through the mountains like ghosts, appearing and disappearing among the rocks with an ease that spoke of generations of knowledge passed down from father to son, mother to daughter. Even the cavalry troopers, men selected for their skill and endurance, were awed by their guide's abilities. "How do they do it?" Sergeant Murphy whispered to Marcus during a brief rest stop. The grizzled Irish veteran had fought in 3 Indian wars and thought he'd seen everything. "Practice," Marcus replied, watching Ayanna scout ahead with the fluid grace of a mountain cat. "And necessity. This is their home, has been for centuries." "Makes you think," Murphy said thoughtfully, "about who really belongs here, I mean." It did make you think. These mountains held memories of Apache families stretching back countless generations, stories carved in stone and whispered by wind through pine trees. What right did men like Morrison have to decide that such history meant nothing compared to railroad profits and mining claims? They reached the final approach to Fort Collins just before dawn, taking position on a ridge overlooking the valley where the military installation spread like a small city in the morning mist. From this distance, Marcus could see sentries walking their posts, smoke rising from cookhouse chimneys, the daily routine of military life proceeding with clockwork precision. It looked so normal, so familiar from his own years of service. Hard to believe that corruption and conspiracy were hiding behind those orderly rows of barracks and administrative buildings. There, Dakota pointed to a large building near the center of the complex, Morrison's quarters. "My scouts have watched him enter and leave many times." "Guards?" Marcus asked, studying the approaches through borrowed field glasses. "2 at the main entrance, none at the rear, but there are windows on the 2nd floor that could be watched from the guard tower." Marcus lowered the glasses, considering options. A direct assault was impossible with so many soldiers in the area. Stealth was their only chance, and stealth required perfect timing. "Captain Reynolds should be entering the main gate about now," he said, checking his pocket watch. "That should draw attention to the administration building. Give us maybe 30 minutes before his report is finished and people start asking questions. 30 minutes to infiltrate the most secure building in the fort, search through Morrison's personal files, find evidence of corruption, and escape without being detected." Marcus had participated in easier missions during the war, but not many. "If we're separated," he told Dakota, "meet at the fallback position. Don't wait for me if something goes wrong." The war chief's expression was unreadable in the pre-dawn darkness. Apache do not abandon brothers in danger. "I'm not Apache," Marcus pointed out. "You wear the stone," Dakota replied simply. "You are what you choose to be." There was no arguing with that logic, so Marcus didn't try. He checked his weapons one final time, made sure the pendant was secure beneath his shirt, and began the careful descent toward Fort Collins. Moving through a military installation undetected required a different set of skills than wilderness survival. Here, the enemy wasn't wild animals or harsh weather, but human vigilance backed by discipline and firepower. Every shadow might hide a sentry. Every sound might trigger an alarm that would bring 200 soldiers running. Marcus had learned such skills during covert operations behind Confederate lines, missions where capture meant certain execution as a spy. The knowledge came back to him now like muscle memory, his body automatically moving with the careful precision that had kept him alive in similar situations. Dakota moved beside him with even greater stealth, the war chief's ability to blend with shadows almost supernatural. Watching him work, Marcus began to understand how Apache raiders had bedeviled army units for decades, appearing from nowhere to strike and vanish before effective response was possible. They reached Morrison's quarters without incident, a 2-story building that served as both residence and office for the commanding officer. The structure was typical Army construction, built for function rather than comfort, but it was larger and better appointed than standard barracks accommodations. Second floor, Marcus whispered, pointing to a window that showed faint lamplight behind drawn curtains. That's where he'd keep important documents. Dakota nodded and produced a coil of rope from his pack. Apache children learn to climb before they learn to walk properly, he said with the ghost of a smile. The ascent to the second floor window was easier than Marcus had expected. The building's log construction provided plenty of handholds, and Dakota's rope made the final approach almost simple. Within minutes, they were crouched outside Morrison's private office, listening for sounds of movement within. Nothing. The room appeared to be empty, lamplight coming from an unattended desk where papers were spread in neat piles. Marcus carefully tested the window latch, finding it unlocked. Frontier security often relied more on distance from enemies than locks and bars. In this case, that overconfidence was about to cost Morrison dearly. They slipped inside like shadows, immediately taking positions where they could watch both the door and the papers on the desk. What they found there exceeded their worst expectations. "Dear God," Marcus breathed, reading the first document he picked up. It was a contract authorizing payment of $500 to civilian contractors for specialized services in territorial pacification efforts. The signature at the bottom was Morrison's, but the date was 3 months old. "What does it mean?" Dakota asked, studying a similar document written in the flowing script that military officers learned at West Point. "It means Morrison's been planning this for months," Marcus replied grimly. "Look at this one. Payment to Jeremiah Baxter for intelligence gathering regarding hostile movements, dated 6 weeks ago." The full scope of the conspiracy became clear as they worked through the papers. Morrison hadn't just been protecting the slave traders. He'd been directing their operations. Payments for capturing specific Apache women who might provide valuable intelligence. Contracts for eliminating potential witnesses to illegal activities. Even detailed maps showing the locations of Apache winter camps. Information that could only have come from tribal scouts working for the Army. "He's been using our own people against us," Dakota said, his voice tight with controlled fury. "Warriors who thought they were serving peace by cooperating with the Army." "There's more," Marcus said, unfolding a larger document that made his blood run cold. "Look at this." It was a territorial survey map showing proposed railroad routes through Apache land, marked with notes about mineral deposits and timber resources. But what made it truly damning was the signature in the corner, James Morrison, Territorial Development Company. Morrison wasn't just a corrupt Army officer. He was a land speculator who stood to make millions if Apache territory could be opened for development. The slave raids, the false reports of Apache hostility, even the planned military action against Dakota's winter camp. All of it was designed to justify seizure of tribal lands for private profit. "We have enough," Marcus said, gathering the most damning documents into a leather portfolio. "This proves everything. Morrison's corruption, his connection to the slavers, his plans for Apache territory." But as they prepared to leave, Dakota noticed something that made him freeze in place. On Morrison's desk, partially hidden beneath other papers, was a hand-drawn map showing the exact location of his people's winter camp. Not the general area where an Army patrol might search, but precise details of defensive positions, water sources, and escape routes. Information that could only have come from someone who'd been inside the camp recently. "We have a spy among my people," Dakota said quietly, the pain in his voice cutting deeper than any physical wound. Before Marcus could respond, they heard the sound that turned their infiltration mission into a desperate flight for survival. Heavy boots on the stairs outside, moving with the purposeful stride of armed men who knew exactly where they were going. Morrison's voice carried clearly through the thin walls. "Check every room. Someone's been through my papers." The trap was closing. Somehow their presence had been detected, and now they were cornered in the one place they couldn't afford to be caught. Marcus stuffed the portfolio inside his coat and moved toward the window, but Dakota grabbed his arm. "The map," the war chief whispered urgently. "We cannot let them know we've seen it." Understanding flashed through Marcus's mind. If Morrison realized they knew about the spy in the Apache camp, he might change his plans, warning his Confederate and making it impossible to identify the traitor. Better to let Morrison think his security had been compromised in some other way. Dakota carefully returned the map to its original position, then joined Marcus at the window just as the footsteps reached the second floor. They could hear Morrison's voice more clearly now, issuing orders with the crisp authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. Sergeant Williams, check the office. Corporal Davis, search the bedroom. If anyone's still in this building, I want them found. The rope was still hanging outside the window, but using it now would mean dropping directly into the courtyard where sentries would spot them immediately. They needed another way out, and they needed it fast. Marcus spotted a door on the far side of the room, probably leading to a back staircase used by orderlies and servants. It was their only chance, assuming they could reach it before Morrison's search party entered the office. They moved across the room like ghosts, every step carefully placed to avoid creaking floorboards. Behind them, they could hear doors being thrown open, voices calling, "Clear," as each room was searched. The net was tightening with military precision. The back staircase was narrow and dark, designed for servants who were expected to remain invisible. Marcus and Dakota descended as quickly as they dared, knowing that speed was now more important than stealth. Every second brought Morrison's searchers closer to discovering their presence. They emerged into a kitchen area where early morning cook details were already preparing breakfast. The smell of bacon and coffee filled the air, along with the cheerful conversation of men who had no idea that their commanding officer was planning to commit war crimes for personal profit. "Morning, boys," Marcus said casually to the surprised cooks, hoping his civilian clothes would make his presence seem less threatening. "Colonel Morrison sent us to check on breakfast preparations." The deception worked long enough for them to cross the kitchen and exit through the back door, but Marcus knew it wouldn't hold up under scrutiny. Within minutes, Morrison would realize that unauthorized personnel had been in his quarters, and the entire fort would be on high alert. They needed to reach the fallback position before that happened. The run through Fort Collins tested every skill Marcus had learned during 8 years of military service, staying in shadows, moving between buildings with purpose rather than panic, avoiding the main thoroughfares where sentries were most likely to be stationed. Dakota matched him step for step, the war chief's ability to remain invisible in plain sight, almost supernatural. They were within 50 yards of the perimeter fence when the alarm bell began ringing. The sound cut through the morning air like a blade, its urgent clamor bringing soldiers pouring out of barracks with weapons in hand. Within seconds, the previously quiet fort had transformed into a hive of armed activity, with patrols moving to secure all exits and search parties forming to sweep every building. Marcus and Dakota pressed themselves against the wall of a supply shed, watching armed soldiers hurry past their hiding spot. The main gate was already sealed, with a full squad of infantry taking defensive positions. The secondary exits would be covered as well, standard procedure for a security alert. "Can we climb the fence?" Marcus whispered. Dakota shook his head. "Too exposed. Sentries in the towers would see us before we reached the wire." They were trapped, 200 soldiers between them and freedom, with evidence that could prevent a massacre hidden in Marcus's coat. If they were captured now, Morrison would destroy the documents and proceed with his planned attack on the Apache winter camp. Hundreds of innocent people would die to protect his conspiracy. That's when Marcus heard a voice he recognized calling orders to a nearby patrol. "Sergeant Murphy, take your squad and search the stables. Check every stall, every feed bin, every pile of hay." Captain Reynolds was here, playing his part in the search while secretly trying to create opportunities for escape. Marcus caught Dakota's eye and pointed toward the sound of Reynolds' voice. If anyone could help them reach safety, it would be the cavalry officer who'd risked his career to expose Morrison's corruption. They moved toward the voice, staying low and using every available piece of cover. The fort was in complete chaos now, with soldiers running in all directions and officers shouting conflicting orders. In the confusion, two more figures moving with purpose attracted little attention. They found Reynolds near the horse stables, issuing orders to his search detail with the kind of theatrical authority that suggested he was performing for Morrison's benefit rather than conducting a real search. "Captain," Marcus called softly from behind a water trough. Reynolds turned, and his expression of relief was quickly replaced by professional concern. "What the hell are you doing here? Morrison knows someone was in his quarters." "We got what we came for," Marcus said, patting the portfolio hidden inside his coat. "Evidence that proves everything. But we need to get out of here before the sentence was interrupted by the arrival of Colonel Morrison himself, striding toward them with the measured pace of a man supremely confident in his authority. Behind him walked two figures that made Marcus's blood freeze in his veins. One was a heavy-set civilian in expensive clothes, clearly a man of wealth and influence. The other was someone Marcus recognized with sinking heart, a young Apache warrior he'd seen at Dakota's winter camp, one of the scouts who'd been working with the army. The spearman, the traitor who'd been feeding information to Morrison for months. "Captain Reynolds," Morrison said, his voice carrying the tone of a man who'd just won a decisive victory. "I believe you know these men." Reynolds' hand moved toward his sidearm, but Morrison shook his head. "I wouldn't. You're outnumbered 50-1, and I have what I need to finish this business once and for all." The colonel's smile was cold as winter steel. "You see, gentlemen, I've been expecting this visit. My sources informed me days ago that certain individuals were planning to interfere with legitimate military operations. I've simply been waiting for you to provide the evidence I need to justify more decisive action." Marcus felt the trap closing around them like iron jaws. Morrison hadn't been caught off guard at all. The entire infiltration had been anticipated, planned for, turned into another piece of his larger conspiracy. "You're wondering how I knew," Morrison continued, clearly enjoying their situation. "Allow me to introduce my associates, Mr. Cornelius Blackwood of the Territorial Development Company, and Joseph Crow Feather, one of Chief Dakota's most trusted scouts." The young Apache warrior stepped forward, his face twisted with something that might have been shame or defiance. When he spoke, his words were directed at Dakota with the venom of long-suppressed resentment. "You call yourself a war chief, but you lead our people toward destruction. The white man's victory is inevitable. I choose to be on the winning side rather than die for your stubborn pride." Dakota's expression showed no surprise, only deep sadness. "I remember teaching you to track deer when you were 8 years old, Joseph. Your father was my friend. What would he think of what you have become?" "He would think I am wise enough to recognize reality," Joseph shot back. "The old ways are dead. Accommodation with white authority is the only path to survival." "Accommodation?" Dakota repeated the word like it tasted bitter. "Is that what you call betraying your own people to slave traders?" Joseph's composure cracked slightly. "I never meant for women to be taken. That was supposed to be intelligence gathering only." "Tell that to my daughters," Dakota said quietly. "Tell that to the families of every woman who was sold into slavery because of your intelligence." Morrison cut short the reunion with a gesture of impatience. "Touching as this is, we have business to conclude. Captain Reynolds, you and your companions are under arrest for theft of classified documents and conspiracy against the United States government." "And what documents would those be?" Reynolds asked, his voice steady despite their desperate situation. Morrison's smile widened. "The ones currently hidden in Mr. Thornfield's coat. Did you really think I'd leave genuine evidence lying around my office? Those papers were carefully prepared to tell exactly the story I wanted told." The full scope of the trap became clear. The documents they'd risked everything to obtain weren't evidence of Morrison's corruption. They were forgeries designed to implicate Reynolds and his allies in a conspiracy against territorial authority. By stealing them, Marcus and Dakota had provided Morrison with all the justification he needed to crush Apache resistance and eliminate anyone who might oppose his plans. "You're going to kill us," Marcus said. It wasn't a question. "Regrettably, yes," Morrison replied. "You'll be shot while resisting arrest, along with the Apache raiders who attacked a legitimate military installation. Your deaths will provide the final proof that peaceful coexistence with hostile tribes is impossible." He gestured to the squad of soldiers surrounding them, men whose faces showed the blank obedience of troops following orders they didn't question. "However," Morrison continued, "I'm not without mercy. Mr. Blackwood has authorized me to offer Chief Dakota a final choice. Surrender your winter camp's location and submit your people for relocation to federal custody. Do this, and I'll ensure they're treated humanely during the transfer process." "And if I refuse?" Dakota asked. "Then my artillery bombardment begins at dawn tomorrow, whether your people have evacuated or not. I have reports of Apache raiders massing for attacks on civilian settlements. Military necessity demands immediate action." It was the final twist of the knife. Morrison would have his war regardless of Dakota's choice. The only question was whether Apache families would have time to flee before the shells began falling. Marcus felt despair settle over him like a heavy blanket. 3 days ago, he'd been a solitary rancher with no responsibilities beyond his own survival. Now he was about to die for people he'd known less than a week, and his death would accomplish nothing except to provide Morrison with propaganda for his massacre. But then he felt the weight of the turquoise pendant against his chest and remembered words spoken by firelight in a small cabin. Some blankets warmed the body, others warmed the soul. Maybe his death would accomplish nothing. But maybe it didn't have to be meaningless. "Colonel," Marcus said, his voice carrying clearly across the stable yard. "Before you have us shot, I think you should know something about those documents." Morrison's eyebrows rose with polite interest. "Oh? They're not the only evidence we found," Marcus lied smoothly. "Captain Reynolds has been maintaining his own files on your activities. Copies of communications, financial records, witness statements, everything needed to prove your connection to the slave trade." "Interesting," Morrison said. "And where are these alleged files?" "Safe," Reynolds said, catching on to Marcus's deception. "In the hands of people you can't reach. People who'll make sure the truth reaches Washington if anything happens to us." It was a desperate gambit, but Marcus could see uncertainty flicker across Morrison's face. The colonel had built his conspiracy on the assumption that he could control information, eliminate witnesses, shape the narrative to serve his purposes. The possibility that evidence existed beyond his reach clearly troubled him. "You're bluffing," Morrison said finally. "Are we?" Marcus asked. "Are you willing to bet your entire operation on that assumption? Because if you're wrong, killing us just guarantees that evidence reaches the territorial governor." The standoff stretched for long moments, neither side willing to break first. Around them, the fort continued its lockdown procedures, but Marcus could sense that Morrison's confidence was beginning to crack. Then Joseph Crow Feather spoke up, his voice eager to please. "Colonel, I know where they would hide such documents. Apache have traditional places for keeping sacred objects safe. I can guide your men to search them." Morrison's smile returned. "Excellent suggestion. Sergeant Williams, prepare a search detail to accompany Mr. Crow Feather. We'll recover these alleged files and put this matter to rest." But Dakota had heard enough. The war chief's hands struck like lightning, his blade appearing at Joseph's throat in one explosive motion before anyone could react. "Enough," Dakota said, his voice carrying the authority of generations of leadership. "You have betrayed our people once. You will not do so again." "Kill him and you all die," Morrison said calmly. "We die anyway," Dakota replied. "At least this way, one traitor dies first." The tension in the stable yard was thick enough to cut with a knife. 50 soldiers with weapons trained on 3 men who refused to surrender. A corrupt colonel whose grand scheme was unraveling. A young Apache caught between 2 worlds, neither of which would ever fully accept him. And in the center of it all, Marcus Thornfield, a man who'd learned too late that some fights were worth having even when you couldn't win them. That's when the real shooting started. The first shot came from the direction of the main gate, a rifle crack that echoed off the stable walls like thunder. It was followed immediately by the wild Apache war cry that had struck fear into frontier settlements for generations. But this time it came from inside the fort itself. Reynolds' most trusted sergeants had been busy while their captain conducted his search. Hidden throughout the installation were 15 hand-picked cavalrymen who'd served under honest officers and knew corruption when they saw it. At Reynolds' prearranged signal, they'd begun their own operation to secure evidence and arrest Morrison's Confederates. The colonel's face went white as he realized his trap had been turned against him. "Impossible. My men would never." "Your men, yes," Reynolds said grimly. "But these are my men, soldiers who believe in honor and duty rather than profit and politics." The fighting that followed was brief but decisive. Morrison's troops, caught off guard and uncertain about which officers to obey, hesitated long enough for Reynolds' loyalists to seize key positions throughout the fort. Within minutes, the corrupt colonel found himself surrounded by soldiers whose allegiance couldn't be bought. But the battle was far from over. Even as Morrison's immediate authority collapsed, the sound of approaching cavalry could be heard from the direction of Denver. The reinforcements he'd requested were arriving right on schedule, and they would have no knowledge of the morning's revelations about their commander's corruption. "2 companies," Reynolds said, listening to the approaching hoofbeats. "Maybe 100 men. They'll restore order first and ask questions later." It was true. The arriving cavalry would see a fort in chaos, officers under arrest, and Apache warriors inside a military installation. Their response would be swift and devastating, restoring Morrison's authority through superior firepower. Unless someone could reach them first and explain the truth. Marcus looked at Dakota, seeing the same desperate calculation in the war chief's eyes. 100 fresh troops against 30 exhausted soldiers and 20 Apache warriors. The mathematics of destruction were simple and unavoidable. "There's another way," Marcus said suddenly. "Mr. Blackwood, you represent civilian authority in this territory. If you were to order the arriving troops to stand down..." Blackwood laughed harshly. "Why would I help you? Morrison's plan serves my company's interests perfectly." "Because dead men can't honor contracts," Marcus replied. "And if this turns into a massacre, questions will be asked in Washington. Investigations will be opened. Your company's connection to illegal activities will be exposed." He was gambling everything on Blackwood's greed overcoming his commitment to Morrison's conspiracy. Territorial development companies lived or died based on their political connections. A scandal involving slave trading and military corruption would destroy those connections permanently. Blackwood's expression showed he was beginning to understand the implications. "What are you proposing?" "Morrison dies resisting arrest," Marcus said coldly. "The slave trading operation is exposed as the work of rogue military personnel. Your company had no knowledge of illegal activities and cooperated fully with federal investigators. And in return, you live, your company survives, and you get to develop Apache land through legitimate treaties rather than manufactured wars." It was a devil's bargain, but sometimes devils made the most reliable partners. Blackwood studied Morrison's pale face, calculating the political costs of continued association with a man whose conspiracy was already unraveling. "Colonel," Blackwood said finally, "I believe our partnership is terminated." Morrison's expression showed he understood exactly what that meant. His hand moved toward his sidearm, but Dakota's knife was faster. The corrupt officer died as he'd lived, reaching for power he'd never truly possessed. The sound of approaching cavalry was getting louder, but now Blackwood was striding toward the main gate with his hands raised and his voice carrying the authority of territorial civilian leadership. "Stand down," he called to the arriving reinforcements. "This installation is under federal investigation for military corruption. I am Cornelius Blackwood, Territorial Development Commissioner, and I order you to maintain defensive positions only." It was exactly the kind of bureaucratic confusion that could freeze military action for hours, while officers tried to determine which authority took precedence. Hours that would give Reynolds time to consolidate his position and present evidence of Morrison's crimes to investigators who couldn't be bought or threatened. The weeks that followed brought a parade of federal investigators, territorial officials, and newspaper reporters to the valley. Morrison's documents, combined with testimony from Reynolds's loyal soldiers and the surviving members of Baxter's gang, painted a damning picture of corruption that reached from frontier outposts to Denver boardrooms. The scandal toppled territorial administrators, reformed Army policies, and established new legal frameworks for Apache settler relations. As the immediate crisis passed, Marcus found himself standing in the stable yard beside Dakota, both men spattered with blood and exhausted by the morning's events. Around them, soldiers were securing prisoners and gathering evidence, the efficient movement of men who knew their duty even when that duty led through moral ambiguity. "It's over," Marcus said, hardly believing it himself. "This part is over," Dakota corrected, "but there will be consequences. Questions asked, investigations opened, treaties renegotiated." He was right. The exposure of Morrison's conspiracy would create political upheaval that might take years to resolve. Apache land rights, military authority, corporate development contracts, everything would need to be examined and renegotiated. But for now, Dakota's people were safe. The planned artillery bombardment would not happen. Children would not die for the sake of railroad profits. "What happens next?" Marcus asked. Dakota smiled, the first genuinely peaceful expression Marcus had seen on the war chief's face. "Now we go home. My daughters will want to hear how their white brother helped save our people. Home. The word carried weight Marcus hadn't felt in 3 years. Since Sarah and Thomas died, he'd been a man without a tribe, without connections, without purpose beyond mere survival. But wearing Dakota's pendant and carrying scars earned in defense of Apache families, he was beginning to understand that home wasn't a place. It was people who mattered enough to fight for. 6 months later, after congressional hearings in Denver and a winter of tense negotiations between territorial authorities and tribal leaders, Marcus stood on the porch of his rebuilt cabin, watching children play in the meadow, where Baxter's gang had died in the snow. Apache children and white children together, learning from each other, building friendships that might prevent the kind of hatred that had driven men like Morrison to such desperate corruption. The cabin was larger now, with rooms for guests and a medical station where Sitlali could treat patients from both communities. The trading post Dakota had established nearby drew merchants from across the territory, men who found that honest dealing with Apache traders was more profitable than the violent alternatives they'd previously employed. Ayanna emerged from the cabin, carrying 2 cups of coffee, her movements as graceful as ever, but now carrying an easiness that spoke of safety and contentment. The relationship that had grown between them wasn't built on desperate need or shared danger, but on mutual respect and genuine affection. "The children are learning fast," she said, settling beside him on the bench he'd built for watching sunsets. Marcus nodded, sipping coffee and watching a young Apache boy teach a settler's daughter how to track deer through the meadow grass. "Maybe they'll do better than we did." "They will," Ayanna said with quiet confidence. "They're not carrying our mistakes." A rider approached from the south, one of the regular mail carriers who'd begun including Marcus's homestead in their route. The letter he delivered bore the seal of the territorial government, the kind of official correspondence that usually meant trouble for frontier families. But this letter brought different news entirely. Morrison's conspiracy had been fully exposed through congressional investigation, leading to reforms in how the Army dealt with tribal peoples. More importantly, it had resulted in a new treaty recognizing Apache sovereignty over their traditional territories, while establishing clear boundaries and trade relationships with neighboring settlements. "Listen to this," Marcus said, reading aloud. "In recognition of services rendered to territorial security and intercultural cooperation, Marcus Thornfield is hereby appointed as official liaison between Apache tribal government and United States Territorial Authority." Ayanna smiled. "Official recognition of what you've been doing anyway." "I suppose." Marcus folded the letter, thinking about how much had changed since that snowy night when he'd made the simple decision to share his blanket with 2 injured women. "Though I'm not sure I need a government title to know what I'm supposed to be doing." The sun was setting behind the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded Marcus of the war paint Dakota had worn during that first confrontation. In the distance, smoke rose from Apache cooking fires and settler chimneys alike, families preparing for another peaceful evening in a valley that had seen too much violence. Thomas's wooden horse sat on the porch railing, returned by Little Wolf's family as part of an Apache ceremony honoring the dead. Beside it lay Sarah's Bible, open to the passage about fearing no evil, physical reminders of love lost, but also of love that continued in new forms. "Do you think they'd approve?" Marcus asked, gesturing toward the symbols of his former life. "Sarah and Thomas, I mean, of what we've built here." Ayanna considered the question seriously, understanding its importance. "I think they'd be proud that you chose to build rather than destroy, that you turned grief into something that helps other families stay together." As if summoned by their conversation, Dakota emerged from the trading post with several Apache elders and white merchants, all of them animated by discussion of some new cooperative venture. At 60, the war chief had found a new role as diplomatic leader, using his reputation for honesty and strength to forge agreements that benefited all the valley's peoples. "Marcus," Dakota called, approaching the cabin, "we need your advice on this lumber contract. The Denver merchants want to include penalty clauses for late delivery, but..." And so the evening proceeded with talk of business and treaties, children's laughter and adult conversation. The ordinary sounds of a community that worked because its people had learned that cooperation was stronger than conflict. As the stars emerged overhead, Marcus touched the turquoise pendant that still hung around his neck, thinking about the words Dakota had spoken that first morning. You are not the man who rode past my sister. You are the man I wished had been there that day. Sometimes the greatest gift you could give someone wasn't a blanket or a meal or medical care, though those things mattered. Sometimes the greatest gift was simply the decision to stop, to see, to care about what happened to people who had no claim on your attention except their common humanity. 3 years ago, Marcus Thornfield had been a broken man, convinced that helping others only led to loss. Tonight, surrounded by family both born and chosen, he understood that the opposite was true. Help freely given came back multiplied in ways that couldn't be measured or planned for. A simple blanket shared on a desperate night had grown into a community, a friendship, a love, a peace that might last for generations. And in a territory where white and Apache children played together while their parents planned shared futures, perhaps that was the most important victory of all. The last honor wasn't dying for a cause. It was living for one, day by day, choice by choice, until the world became a little more like what it should be rather than what it had always been. Marcus Thornfield, brother who shares warmth, had finally come home.